Have you heard or maybe even said the phrase, gauge swatches lie? Today we're going to talk about why it's not your gauge swatch who's lying, it's Just kidding. Kind of. Hello, and welcome to Bla Bla Black Sheep, a weekly yarny podcast where I, Sarah Korth of SEK Handmade, talk all things yarny. Today we're talking about gauge. Hold up, don't go anywhere. I know this is not most people's favorite topic. However, gauge can be incredibly important, and I have a little bee in my bonnet about the phrase, gauge swatches lie. So let's dive right in and talk about why your gauge swatch is not lying to you. Don't be so paranoid. First, let's talk about what gauge is. You may have heard people talk about gauge or seen it listed in a pattern, but not really understood what it even means. Gauge simply means the size of the stitches that the designer worked. Seems pretty simple, but if you've ever tried to meet gauge and struggled with it, you can know it can be complicated and frustrating. So you may be thinking to yourself, why even bother with gauge? My grandma never gauge swatched. So why is gauge important? When you're trying to meet gauge, you're trying to make your stitches the same size as the designer's stitches. And while that can be challenging, here's why it's important. One, it affects fit. If you work the same number of stitches in a very different size from the designer, your finished project will end up a very different size. So if you have anything that needs to even kind of fit someone, having incorrect gauge is totally gonna muck that up. Or if you're lucky, muck it up a little bit. The other reason gauge is super important is amount of yarn. If all of your stitches are this big and all of the designer stitches were this big is going to use up a lot less yarn than this big. So even if you're making something where size and fit don't matter, you could end up running out of yarn. Or if your gauge shifts in the other direction, you could end up with a ton of yarn left over. So why do people then say that gauge swatches lie? It can be incredibly frustrating if you have worked hard to work up a gauge swatch where your stitches are the same size as the designer stitches, and then as you go to work your project, something happens, we're going to talk about that something, where you're no longer meeting gauge, and now what was the point of the swatch because your finished project is still ending up totally wrong. That is why people say gauge swatches lie. Here's the trouble with that. Your gauge swatch, it's inanimate. It has no skin in the game. It couldn't care less if you meet gauge or not. So implying that your gauge swatch lies kind of implies some nefariousness to your gauge swatch, which it obviously doesn't have. But I think this is the most important part. It also takes the responsibility off of you and puts it on your gauge swatch. Now, if you're feeling a little called out, I understand. And I totally think that it's a self-protective technique to blame other things when we are having issues, because then we don't have to really take responsibility for them. But if you want your projects to fit and you don't want to run out of yarn or end up with lots of leftover yarn, you got to take some responsibility for your gauge swatch. Let me give you a few reasons that your gauge swatch might not be matching your gauge on your finished project first. The number one reason your gauge swatch doesn't meet your final project is that you're doing your gauge swatch wrong. I get it. That's hard to hear, but it's only going to get worse. When you see gauge listed in a pattern, it's listed as 4 by 4 inches. So what most people think is I need to work the number of stitches and rows listed in the gauge and make those be a 4 by 4 inch square. That is not the case. What you need to do is you need to work a bigger gauge swatch. I'm going to say 6 by 6 inches minimum. I know that's not what you want to hear. But you should be measuring in the center of your fabric and not your fabric edge to edge. Those edge stitches and rows aren't going to be as accurate as the center of a piece of fabric. So the first thing you need to do is make your gauge swatch larger. I would say that the larger the project, probably the larger you want your gauge swatch to be. So if you're making a sweater, a 6x6 might not be big enough. You might even want to go 8x8 or 9x9. The more fabric you have, the more likely that your gauge making that fabric is going to match the gauge you work in your finished project. The other reason your gauge swatch lies is because you're not a machine. If you're a perfectionist like me, or even if you've just been told that make a gauge swatch and you'll be okay, it's easy to think, I've made that gauge swatch, now I'm all set, I should easily be able to keep the same gauge I made in my gauge swatch in my project. Unfortunately, you're a person and not a machine, and so that's not always true. Even Weston is upset about that. So now that I've hopefully convinced you that your gauge swatch isn't actually nefariously lying to you, what do you do about it? The first thing you're going to do is make that much larger gauge swatch. Then you're going to go ahead and take some measurements before you block or alter it in any way. Write these measurements down because these measurements are going to be the gauge that you're aiming for while you're working on your project. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to block your gauge swatch, and don't tell me you don't need to block it. If you've just been kind of like stretching it this way and that and being like, close enough. Who are you blaming your gauge swatch for lying? You've been cheating. So go ahead, fully block it, however you're going to do that, whether that's steam blocking or wet blocking. Make sure it fully dries. That is the gauge that should then match the gauge in the pattern. Go ahead, write that gauge down carefully too, because if it's not perfect, it doesn't mean you can't make the project. It just means that you might need to make some little adjustments here and there. We're not going to go fully into that. I have a whole entire playlist about gauge that I'm going to send you to if you want more details on that. And then the last thing you're going to do to make sure that your gauge continues to be close to the same, remember we're not a machine, we can't be perfect, but that it remains close to what you were working with, is you're going to, as you work your project, check your gauge. There are lots and lots of things that can change your gauge as you're working on a project, especially if you end up working on it over a long period of time. It's very easy to have gauge change. That's why you need to keep checking back in so that you don't get really deep into your project with a wrong gauge and have to tear a bunch out. I know I was a little cheeky about the whole gauge swatch not lying situation, but I hope you found this helpful, and I hope that this eases some stress in future projects. Today I'm wearing my Simone shawl. This is a great spring shawl. It's a small asymmetrical shawl, and it's worked from the long end to the short end. So one of the things that feels great about this shawl is you start out big when you're enthusiastic about it, and it gets smaller and smaller and smaller as you work on it. It's super satisfying. It's made up out of Blue Sky Fibers yarn. These are like the perfect springy colors. I'm ready for spring, guys. And then to wear it, I've used a little shawl pin. This is by Jewel Designs. And then last but not least, my earrings. These are a classic and a favorite by Mandrel Works. It's a wavy ring, and I wear them all the time because they're just really, really wonderful. Links to the pattern and all the small businesses are in the show notes below. You don't need to go hunt them down. Happy shopping. Just a couple quick announcements. The 2-year anniversary of the Bla Bla Black Sheep podcast is next week. I am so thrilled. As a little celebration of that, I'm going to be releasing some really fun sheepy patterns. So be sure to sign up for my email list if you'd like the very best discount code, or at the very least, subscribe and turn on notifications here so that you'll get a notification so that you can check them out when they come out. Also, another great reason to subscribe is that our 100th episode is coming very soon, and I'm going to have a special little celebratory giveaway for the 100th episode. So again, subscribe, turn on notifications, give this a like, maybe even share it with a friend. I am so glad you are here. Thank you so much for joining me today. We'll be back here again next week. Until then, happy crafting.